It could be said that the horror genre really came into its own with the 5th console generation and the PlayStation 1 in particular, though the Atari Jaguar was a horror unto itself. Two huge names are obviously contenders for the top spots when it comes to the best horror games on the OG PlayStation, but what about the rest? These games still offer some scares when played today, but nothing is quite as scary as the idea of Phoenix Games coming back from the dead. Number 10. Kudelka. There aren't very many PS1 horror games with tactical RPG elements, and even fewer of them are set in Wales, the best country in the world, so that alone makes the underrated 1999 release Kudelka all the more interesting. It's not a blend you might be expecting, with the story centering around a young woman named Kudelka and her investigation of a super spooky monastery, but it's one that developer Saknoff really succeeded in bringing together that might scratch the itch for Parasite Eve fans. Joined by two other investigators, players will control Kudelka across a highly complex supernatural mystery that should appeal to Shadow Hearts fans, cause, well, this is the first game in that cult classic series. The item management and other RPG elements might be initially frustrating to those who don't play turn-based games, but it's still accessible enough that you'll be spending most of your time completely absorbed in this dark, brutal plot. Kudelka finds numerous small ways to keep the gameplay from getting too tedious. The weapon system here is particularly cool. Weapons can be improved after repeated use, but will eventually break if you rely on them too much, which stops you from having cruxes. With horrific, brilliantly designed monsters and some really quite amazing animations for the time, it's easy to see why Kudelka is one of the best PS1 horror games and something of a cult classic in its own right. Number 9. Nightmare Creatures. Nightmare Creatures has everything you could want from a good horror game on the OG PlayStation. You've got some of the best video game monsters ever designed, a genuinely unsettling story centered around an occult expert investigating a contagion that transforms the citizens of 19th century London into horrific demonic beings. Hey now, wait a minute. And some of the heaviest, thickest horror atmosphere the PlayStation ever saw. It checks every genre box nicely, and it's not a huge surprise that the game shifted 1.5 million units, enough to get a sequel in 2003. A sequel that wasn't anywhere near as beloved, sadly. But what about the gameplay itself? Well, with a focus on melee combat in a hack-and-slash environment, Nightmare Creatures offers a very different sort of challenge from many other survival horror games. Armed with an adrenaline bar, players must seek out fights, otherwise the bar will go down and eventually deplete your actual health. This game keeps you at a constant relentless pace across both playable characters.
Which was the style at the time.
But you might find the adrenaline mechanic a bit Marmite these days. It is kinda brutal. Nightmare Creatures does not mess around, as this is also one of the hardest horror games too. Funnily enough, many people forget that it also came to N64, and its sequel even came to Dreamcast, but funniest of all is that it had a mobile version that saw a release in 2003 too? What? Number 8. Dino Crisis 2. It's hard to talk about the Dino Crisis series without getting a touch depressed, especially if your balls are still extremely blue from Exoprimal. It's been 21 years since Dino Crisis 3, which somehow feels like not enough time, and while Dino Crisis 2 for the PS1 isn't the best of the two games in the series that don't suck, it's still a fantastic, somewhat somber reminder of one of the most neglected survival horror franchises of all time. The only thing that really keeps Dino Crisis 2 from a higher ranking is the fact that it's so overwhelmingly packed with dinosaurs to fight and kill. The actual horror side of things can feel a little non-existent at times. Honestly, it can feel a touch arcadey too, especially with that giant floating point system. Still, with limited ammo and a plethora of intelligent creatures who want to eat the shit out of you, no one can deny that Dino Crisis 2, which brings back hero Regina from the first game while adding a new dude called Dylan, knows how to keep you in a state of tension. Besides being just straight up fun to play, Dino Crisis 2 also has some excellent puzzles, some really gorgeous environments for the time, and the ability to dual wield like Regina is a down on her luck cop with a pill problem. This is a difficult, exhilarating horror game to play, and it's a worthy sequel that deserves some kind of modern port or remaster, and that's at the very least. Number 7, Clock Tower 1996. Probably the only survival horror series on the PS1 to be directly inspired by a Dario Argento movie, Clock Tower, which is actually the second game in the series after the 1995 Super Famicom Japan original, is an acquired taste for sure, but one that plenty of us freakazoids lapped up. Its success paved the way for another sequel, Clock Tower 2 The Struggle Within, which was released in North America in 1999, but that one's probably just for people who have smoked more hash than Argento himself. Oh, and just in case you are about to light one up, that original game did eventually come to PlayStation in 1997 as Clock Tower The First Fear. That game is now also coming to modern platforms as Clock Tower Rewind. Are you with us? I'm not sure I am. In this, the actually good brand new Clock Tower PS1 game, players control a young girl named Jennifer Simpson, who is very clearly originally modelled on Jennifer Connelly in Phenomena. No, really, go watch that movie immediately. After surviving the fiendish Scissor Man in the first game, Jennifer once again finds herself threatened by the Man-O-Scissors and a mystery that will pull her and her new adoptive mother, Helen, deeper into an unknown and terrifying world. Clock Tower blends serious and deep mystery with the amped up tension of knowing something is chasing you every step of the way, even if Scissor Man really is just a silly little dude. The point and click mechanics might have felt a bit slow, maybe unintuitive to those used to Resident Evil back in the day, but they give it a very interesting flavour today. Clock Tower offers a rich gothic atmosphere to get lost in, with memorable, likeable characters to anchor the whole thing, and most importantly, some genuinely terrifying moments. Nothing is quite as terrifying as these prices though. The bad one costs even more, presumably because 9 people bought it. Those poor 9 people. Number 6, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was a worthwhile last hurrah for the franchise on the system that made it famous. Well, if we're ignoring Resident Evil Survivor, which yes, we actually are going to do that.
Vincent, please, listen to your mother. I want you to leave Umbrella. I want you to stop performing those terrible crimes and just come back home.
That being said, Nemesis just didn't quite live up to the extraordinarily high bar established by its predecessors. There's really no shame in not being quite as good as 2 of the best survival horror games, no, best games in general ever made, especially when you're as good as Nemesis still is. It's also important to keep in mind that Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a relatively different experience from the previous installment. Released in 1999, just 1 year after the success of Resident Evil 2, Nemesis opted for a more action-oriented approach. There's still some puzzle solving to be done here, but the emphasis comes down to more zomboids, more monsters, and the constant threat of the hellish Nemesis creature itself. Jill Valentine is trapped in the ever whimsical Raccoon City with this newest, least cuddly abomination, who is a consistently potent threat. The overall tension in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis gives it a unique atmosphere for the series, and the introduction of choices at certain moments, smoother movement, and dodging makes up a bit for the lack of a second playable character and scenarios like in earlier games. Nemesis is a welcome deviation from the formula that also doesn't stray too far, with no one at Capcom being able to stray too far from their desks with the frankly irresponsible turnaround time on its development, with Nemesis originally planned to just be a spin-off. It is kinda crazy really that Capcom had the chance to publish a remake that would fix some of this game's mistakes, but really just made the same ones and maybe worse. The 2020 game is not a bad game at all, but it is a missed opportunity. That's almost as bad really. Number 5, Parasite Eve. Itself a sequel to a very rare 1995 Japanese novel, the 1998 Square action RPG Parasite Eve is a good indicator of just how wild Square's publishing slate was getting when they moved shop over to Sony and the PS1. Parasite Eve follows a
New York City.
police officer named Arya over a period of 6 days, with the fate of the world now in the hands of a mutated woman being controlled by mitochondria who seems hellbent on obliterating humanity to create their own world and order. Ugh, I hate when that happens. Well, maybe. It's a little confusing. Parasite Eve has a complex narrative, but it's not inaccessible by any means. This extends to the combat. Imagine the turn-based mechanics of a Final Fantasy with the more strategic action of an early Resident Evil, and you have an idea of how Parasite Eve is easy to pick up and understand. Special tools allow you to upgrade your weapons and armor, and Arya will level up as she moves through the unique, visceral story. You'll probably also appreciate the fact that Parasite Eve has an absolutely bonkers body horror narrative, with some of the most visually disturbing graphics you'll find in a horror game from the PS1 era. The opening scene alone, in which the attendees of an opera suddenly begin exploding and bursting into flames, is an intense and unforgettable set piece. You have no choice but to investigate, but soon find yourself with deeper stakes in what's going on than you ever realised. We never got this through official channels here in Europe, but we did get the second game, weirdly enough, which is also good but just didn't quite make the cut here. Should it have done? Let us know down below. Number 4, Dino Crisis. (1999's) Dino Crisis from Capcom, who we think seem to know a thing or two about horror on the PS1, finds its terror in more of a movie monster format, with a focus on killing every dinosaur that's stopping you from escaping a mad scientist's private research island. Dino Crisis feels more like Jurassic Park, with the horror factor of Dennis Nedry getting gobbled up turned way up rather than just Resident Evil again, but the same formula for creating tension through a mix of claustrophobia, vicious enemies, finding keys in random orifices, and bloody spooky corridors can be found here. As in the sequel, players assume the role of a Special Forces op named Regina, and there's a much more unforgiving emphasis on item management here than in the sequel. Regina must find special plugs that can be used to unlock containers of emergency items found all over the island. The problem, and this is just one way the game brilliantly stacks the deck against you, is that there are very limited number of plugs to go around. Don't expect Dino Crisis to slow down just because you're running low on essentials either. Oh, and also there's T-Rexes coming out of the goddamn walls. Yeah, it's a lot. There's a sense of barely surviving that comes with the threat and puzzles of Dino Crisis that even today can leave you feeling as though you just survived a war. Here's one war we'll never stop fighting. Port these damn games, Capcom. Number 3, Resident Evil. So yeah guys, let's be honest, there's not much more to be said about this game that countless video essays, think pieces and menus haven't already said. Resident Evil quite simply changed everything for this genre, taking what the likes of Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark laid out and running with it. Yeah, running the f*** away from those windows. A massive franchise was born back in 1996 when this launched for the original PlayStation, and developers and publishers alike found themselves coming back with their own ideas. Resident Evil was basically the Magnum being blasted from the starting block for a whole genre. Resident Evil will be celebrating its 30th anniversary soon enough, good god, and it's incredible how much of the game at its core is still a blast to play. While the 2002 HD remake is the best way to play the first RE and arguably the greatest horror game ever made, if you find yourself with the PS1 original, you'll be stuck by how good this game still is where it really counts. We know the story, with a special team called STARS forced to take up shelter in a bizarre mansion. It's weird how Hollywood doesn't know that. Why are they so scared of making a Resident Evil movie set in the mansion? Come on guys. We certainly know the mansion and its many horrors, monsters and puzzles, and we will always know to seriously stay away from the windows. Our introduction to Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield and the gang can still show you why it was an industry changer even today. Number 2, Silent Hill. Here's one of the many games that probably wouldn't exist without that prior game. However, Silent Hill immediately proved itself to be something much different and arguably far darker when it launched in 1999. Players must guide a poor old bastard named Harry Mason as he explores a monster-packed town called Silent Hill in search of his missing daughter. The game starts you off with basically nothing. You can even miss an essential item if you aren't paying attention. All you can do is move forward through this foggy and eerily still ghost town, investigating objects, avoiding monsters, and talking to people when they do happen to show up. The mystery that unfolds is pretty fascinating, and Silent Hill also benefits from an excellent cast of interesting, often sympathetic characters. There's a deeper call with Silent Hill and its emotionally complex message that goes beyond simply twatting the monsters with a pipe until they go away. The themes and ideas explored in the game are just as important as the incredible graphics, iconic monsters, and sense of overwhelming supernatural dread that permeates your desperate bid to stay alive under the direst possible circumstances. Silent Hill is one of the best PS1 games ever, to say nothing of its importance to the history of horror too, and that's not just video games. A true lightning in a bottle experience, many developers, even some within Konami itself, have tried to replicate the look and feel of Team Silent's iconic series, but there will never be anything quite like Silent Hill ever again. And number 1, Resident Evil 2. For some, Resident Evil as a franchise has never been quite as good in its blend of puzzle solving, action and survival horror as it was with its second entry. A massive seller for the PS1, Resident Evil 2 firmly established not only the series but the genre it had helped to popularise. Everything people loved about the first game can still be found here, but with big improvements in gameplay, graphics and sound, and even the story itself. You might not believe it nowadays, but back in the day, the visual and technical leap between the two games was kinda crazy to behold. Honestly, it was like profoundly amazing. Resident Evil 2 properly brought us into Raccoon City for the first time, establishing the game's larger universe and thrusting us into a city hellscape that's been revisited by the IP again and again and again and again and again. Go on Capcom, do it one more time. Resident Evil Outbreak 3? Who says no? There's something about that initial Raccoon City outbreak that's just invulnerable to feeling stale, really. With 2 intertwined campaigns and better controls, it's easy to get sucked into Resident Evil 2. It has what many Resi fans believe is the perfect balance of mystery, action, puzzle solving, and even a certain degree of exploration. Resident Evil 2 does immediately give you the feeling that you've just been dumped into the middle of a city experiencing the zombie apocalypse, while I personally would have liked just a tiny bit more action on the streets overall. The Raccoon Police Station is up there with the most iconic locations across all of gaming, even if its architect had almost definitely been at Argento's hash stash. The remake of Resident Evil 2 may arguably be the best version of the game, even though it's obviously actually the Game.com version, but the original just holds a special, almost timeless quality that captured the magic of the PS1 era of gaming better than almost any other game on the system, and that's why it's the best PS1 horror game of all time. Happy spooky season! That was our video going over just 10 of the best horror games of all time on the PS1. What did we miss? What was too high? What was too low? Let us know down below. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, and thank you for watching.